All right, my friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm your host, Scott Horton, and my next guest is Juan Cole. He is a professor of modern Middle East and South Asian history at the University of Michigan, is the author of the books Colonialism and Revolution in the Middle East, Social and Cultural Origins of Egypt's Urabai Movement, Modernity and Millennium, The Genesis of the Baha'i Faith in the 19th Century Middle East, and Sacred Space and Holy War. His blog, Informed Comment, is one of the best sources for information on what's going on in the Middle East on the entire internet. It's available at juancole.com. Welcome back to the show, Juan.
Thanks so much.
Honored to have you here, Professor Cole. And I guess we should start basically where I was starting a minute ago with the rally in D.C. today. The reports I'm seeing, upwards of 250,000 people have descended on the nation's capital today.
Well, it's a big sea change in public attitude towards the war, obviously.
And it'll be interesting to see what effect it has in the end. I guess this administration is known for making their own reality and ignoring the rest of us.
Well, I'm afraid to say that most administrations do that. I don't know of anyone who thinks that the anti-war protests in the Nixon era really were what ended the Vietnam War. In many ways, it was Nixon's resignation and Ford's advent that allowed that war to end. And I think the 06 elections and the 07-08 presidential elections, that's really when we're going to see the possibility for change.
Well, and really to get this pressure really building up now in advance of the elections a year from now, that really is what counts. Don't you think, whether the Republicans in the House think that Bush's position helps or hurts them?
That's right. I think the Republicans in the House are kind of stuck with Bush, and he's their flag bearer, and they have to support him. But if Democrats can make the war an issue in the next congressional elections and begin to change the character of the Senate and the House, that's what would count.
Okay, now we got to get to the news. Big news in the last week about the two British undercover operatives who were arrested in Basra. Now, apparently, news reports say that they were, that I guess Iraqi police were coming to investigate them, and they shot at the Iraqi police, killing one of them. And then upon their arrest, it was discovered that despite being dressed up as Arabs of some description, they were in fact British SAS guys. And then the British came in after a couple of battles and skirmishes. They finally came in with overwhelming force, tanks and helicopters, and broke down the wall of a jail, freeing 150 prisoners, and then eventually the two guys they came looking for as well, I guess. Is that a more or less accurate summary of what happened there in Basra the other day?
Yes, it's the most amazing story. I would say that many of the details that have come out in the press have been challenged at one point or another, so it's really murky. It's been denied that the SAS guys killed any police, for instance, and it seems to me that this incident is just shedding light on the security situation in the southern port city of Basra, which is a city of about 1.3 million, largely Shiite, and where the British have for some time had a policy of simply farming out most policing and security duties to local militias, Shiite religious militias, who are also paramilitaries of the parties that won the January 30th elections in Basra province. So the British really don't have a lot to say about this. The elected government can appoint whomever it pleases to the police. But the British began to suspect that one of these religious militias, led by a man named Sheikh Ahmed Fartusi, which is a offshoot of the Sadr movement of Muqtada Sadr, but not under his direct control. was blowing up British troops. There were two incidents, September 5th and September 11th, in which British troops were bombed. And the British became convinced that it was this radical Shiite group that was behind it. So they arrested Fartusi and a couple of his aides. And when the SAS guys were discovered and taken into custody by the Iraqi police in Basra, the Fartusi militia had contacts on the inside, and they were interested in using the two men as hostages to trade for Fartusi and his aides. So the British, I think, were simply unwilling to accept that such a situation should develop. They sent in 10 tanks, and they leveled the central Basra jail to get out their two guys. They found they weren't there. They had been transferred to a safe house of the Fartusi movement, and then the British were able to track them down there and go and free them. So the whole thing is a kind of subterranean, ongoing rivalry, turf battle between the 8,500 British troops in the south and these religious Shiite militias who really have more or less taken over.
Well, what do you suppose they were doing dressed up as Arabs?
Well, there are a number of, there's a lot of speculation about this, there are a number of possibilities. Their cover story is that they were gathering information, that they were out on the street listening. They presumably have good Arabic, and that they were undercover for that purpose. Some reports say that they were heavily armed, and it is also possible, and I'm just speculating, I have no proof of this, it seems to me possible that they were an assassination team, and that they might have been out there targeting radical militia leaders who they suspected of blowing up British chiefs.
Do we know whether they were dressed to look like Sunnis or whether they were dressed to seem like they were part of the Mahdi army or anything that specific?
The Mahdi army people don't have a uniform. So if you dressed up like a poor person in Basra, that would be as close as you could get.
I see.
So yeah, there were reports that they were dressed as Mahdi army militiamen. And those reports, it seems to me, to be malicious. That is to say, that's ridiculous. There is no such thing. And whoever said that is spreading false information.
But there's nothing to indicate that they were posing as Sunnis, preparing to, say, for example, like an agent provocateur thing in order to cause some violence and blame it on another ethnicity.
Yeah, to my knowledge, if you were dressed in Arab clothing in Basra, by looking at you, there'd be no way to tell whether you were Sunni or Shiite.
Okay.
That they were agent provocateur has been alleged, that they were, planning to blow something up, say, and then blame it on someone in order to cause trouble as a pretext for the British troops staying in Basra. All these sorts of things, you find them in the blogosphere. They don't make any sense to me personally. The two big bombings we've had recently both involved the death of British troops. So I really don't think the British are blowing up their own troops. I mean, that goes a bit too far to think that. And so it just seems to me the most likely story is either they were gathering information or they were an assassination team.
Well, I would probably disagree with you that they wouldn't do something like that, although I don't think that even if they would, that indicates that's exactly what they were up to. But in Ireland, of course, the British would do stuff like that, get British people killed in order to blame it on the IRA, and vice versa as well, right?
Well, there have been allegations of that sort, but I'm unaware of any allegations that the British Army has blown up its own troops. And that's a different order of... And moreover, an operation like that, you'd really risk someone spilling the beans about it. Remember, you can't be sure within an organization that people are willing to go through with things like that. You get a couple of British Army guys and you tell them to go blow up other British Army guys. I mean, I think that's really a difficult kind of operation to pull off, and I think it's very difficult to keep it secret. You'd face the possibility of whistleblowing. So it just seems to me unlikely.
Right. Okay, now, did you see Bob Dreyfus's article yesterday, Badr versus Sadr?
I didn't see the whole thing. Somebody sent it to me by email, and I skimmed the first part of it.
It's a very interesting story there. He sort of makes analogy with the Hatfields and the McCoys. and says that it's the Sadrs, basically the Sadr family versus the Hakim family, and that's really kind of the underlying source of tension between the Mahdi army and the people loyal to Muqtada al-Sadr and the Skiri and Dawa parties more loyal to Ayatollah Sistani. Is that about right, you think?
It's not far off the mark. I would say that the situation is more complex than that. That there are a lot of followers of Muqtada al-Sadr, for instance, who would also say that they're loyal to Sistani, who would deny that there's much difference between the two.
Right. I'm sorry.
No, and then the Dawa party at one point had announced that it was following Sheikh Fadlallah in Lebanon as its leader, and I think more recently most of them have swung around to Sistani. But that can't be taken for granted either.
All right, everybody, we got to take a short break here. We're talking with Juan Cole, professor of history at the University of Michigan. His website is juancole.com for the Informed Comment blog, and we'll be right back.
His final words: don't take your guns to town, son. Leave your guns at home, Bill. Don't take your guns to town.
All right, my friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton, and I'm talking with Juan Cole. He's a professor of history at the University of Michigan and runs the Informed Comment blog at juancole.com. And, I was supposed to mention to you, sir, my previous guest, Ann Norton, author of Leo Strauss and the Politics of American Empire, wanted me to pass on her compliments to you.
Oh, that's very kind.
For your very informed comments. And so what's we're talking about the splits within the Shiite community in Iraq, the Badr and the Sadr. So I guess really before we get too far into that, I ought to let you sort of give people a broad sort of general picture of who and what we're talking about down there.
Yeah, well, in many ways, the story goes back to the late 50s when the Dawa Party was founded by Shiites, really on a model of the Communist Party. Just as the Communists wanted to organize workers for a workers' paradise, the Dawa Party wanted to organize Shiites for a Shiite paradise, and they wanted to work towards an Islamic state with Islamic law as the law of the land. And they had some success in attracting party members through the 1960s and 70s. By the late 70s, the ruling Ba'ath Party, which had come to power in a coup, was very afraid of them. And they became especially afraid of them when Khomeini came to power in Iran in 1979, because Khomeini turned to the Iraqi Shiites, who were a majority, and said, well, why don't you overthrow the Ba'ath Party the same way we overthrew the Shah? And then so Saddam cracked down hard on the Shiites. In 1980, he made it a capital crime. It was illegal to belong to the Dawa Party, and if the secret police found that you were a member, you would be killed. A lot of those people in the mass graves were Dawa Party members who were found out. So a lot of Iraqi Shiites then fled Iraq. Over time, as many as 200,000 to 400,000 of them, and went over to Iran. And some of them were in Tehran, some of them were in the southwest. And the ones in Tehran, many of them had been clerical leaders, or they were sons of clerical leaders, and they formed the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, which was an umbrella group, as the name suggests, and its goal was to overthrow the Ba'ath Party in Iraq and make a Shiite state. And it was led from 1984 by Mohammed Bakr al-Hakim, a prominent younger cleric at that time, whose father, Mohsen al-Hakim, had been the Sistani of his day, had been the spiritual leader of the Shiites of Iraq in the 1960s. So the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, this umbrella group of Iraqi Shiite political parties, formed a paramilitary group called the Badr Corps, and they started going over from Iran, sneaking into Iraq and blowing things up. They were essentially a terrorist organization. So the Badr Corps and the Supreme Council came back to Iraq after the fall of Saddam in 2003 and established themselves all throughout the Shiite South and made political offices and so forth, and began asserting themselves, and they did very well in the January 30th elections.
And they had been in Iran the whole time before that?
They had been based in Iran since 1980.
Oh.
Or they were formed in 82. So their members had been in Iran all this time. They're very close to the Iranian Ayatollahs. And now they won the provincial governor post, the majority on the provincial councils, in 9 of 11 provinces in Iraq that have a substantial Shiite population, including Baghdad province. They run Baghdad province. So, the Khomeini would be very pleased. This was their whole goal, was to take over Baghdad, and they did them remarkably well in the elections. And they are one of 3 parties. The Dawa Party, which had been founded in 58, still exists, and it was kind of underground and persecuted, and now it's reemerged. And Prime Minister Ibrahim Jaafari is from that party, and it is in competition with the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq. It doesn't have as big a paramilitary as the Supreme Council. It has some fighters, but I think fewer than the Badr Corps. And then the third big group is the Sadr movement. This was founded in the 1990s by Mohammad Sadiq al-Sadr, who was a rival of Sistani, and who was a very puritanical, very hard line, ultimately got in trouble with Saddam because of these things, and was killed by Saddam in 1999. And his son, Muqtada al-Sadr, then came to head up the movement, even though he's quite young. And these guys, the Sadr movement, are very ghetto. The bulk of the movement are poor Shiites, mainly in the slums of the Shiite South, East Baghdad, where there are 2 or 3 million of them, the sort of poor districts of places like Amara, and even a small number of them in the far south in Basra. So, I compared Muqtada al-Sadr in one article to Tupac Shakur. He's a gangster. He's got all of these guys with guns from the slums. And so, sure, the Sadr movement, the Sadr family had been a kind of clerical aristocracy in Iraq, and the Hakims have been there a long time and played a very prominent role. And the Dawa Party is of old standing. So all of these groups have competition with one another.
Now, you said that I want to get to Sadr again a little more after the break, but you said that the Dawa Party and Skiri are sort of in competition with each other. Do they cooperate to a greater degree than Skiri cooperates with Sadr and his movement?
Yeah, up until now, Dawa and Skiri have made a kind of alliance, but right. There are signs of a split.
Okay, all right, everybody. We'll be right back with Juan Cole on the Weekend Interview Show. All right, my friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton, and I'm talking with Juan Cole from the University of Michigan. His blog is juancole.com, The Informed Comment. And before the break, sir, you were saying that there's beginning to emerge a split between the Dawa Party and Skiri. Now, I know that at least at this point, the major split between the Sadr movement and Skiri is the Ayatollah Sistani's encouraging of people to vote for the Constitution, his approval of the Constitution. Is that what is causing the split between the Dawa Party and Skiri, or is there something else there?
No, the Dawa Party and the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq made an electoral alliance, under Sistani's auspices in fall of 2004, and they came to power together in the Iraqi parliament and in the new government. So Dawa got the prime ministership. Skiri got a number of important cabinet posts, including Ministry of Interior. So they've had an alliance with one another, but Dawa did not do very well in the provincial elections, and Skiri obviously outmaneuvered them, and there's dissent within the ranks about this. Jaffrey has faced a party revolt in his own party. There was an attempt about a month ago to replace him as party head because people are dissatisfied. Dawa is out there in the provinces, has been all along, but it's doing a lot of social community work. Hospitals and other services are being established, but it hasn't translated that into electoral power. When fighting broke out recently in Najaf between followers of the Supreme Council and members of the Sadr militia, and the Supreme Council people went in and burned down the Sadr headquarters in Najaf, Ibrahim Jaffrey actually took Sadr's side in that. He condemned the Skiri people for having acted so aggressively.
Maybe the Dawa have decided that the future is with Sadr and not Sistani?
No, I don't think that it works like that. As I said before, people don't think, most Iraqi Shiites don't think of Sistani and Sadr as enemies. They are in some real ways, but they're all sort of the religious hierarchy. It's like, I suppose if you wanted to make an analogy, there are probably cardinals who don't like Pope Benedict's policies very much, right?
Sure.
But they're all the Vatican. So there's an outward facade of kind of relative unity. And then inside, the battles go on. So Dawa, I think the Dawa party members are pretty committed to Sistani, and they're committed to the Constitution. And the Constitution is essentially a negotiation of Dawa and Skiri on the one hand and the Kurds on the other. So it's their Constitution. They're supporting it. The conflict, I think, more is on Skiri having this paramilitary, having gained so much power in the provincial councils, and sort of being now the 900-pound gorilla. And I think that Dawa is not happy about being marginalized.
Right, they're kind of worried because they don't have a Badr brigade of their own.
Yeah, they don't. I think the Badr brigade, last I knew, was about 15,000 men under arms, trained primarily by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. Dawa does have the ability to field some local militias, in neighborhoods. You can get some guys together with guns to patrol. But it doesn't have a structured military the way that the Supreme Council does. Now,
al-Sadr, they say that he's not quite so loyal to Iran, that he's much more of an Iraqi nationalist than Sistani.
The Sadr movement has a rhetoric of Iraqi nativism, that we're Arabs, we're sons of the soil. Sistani is an Iranian by birth and is kind of a foreigner, so yes, and of course, as I said, the movement is very ghetto, so it's very rooted in these Shiite slums of the south. Many of the adherents are first-generation urban people whose parents or grandparents came from small villages in the Shiite south and had been rural one generation before. So it thinks of itself as a very Iraqi nativist movement.
A couple of months ago, there were 2 or 3 months ago, I guess, quite a few of Sistani's men were killed. Some of his closest right-hand men. Do you have any indication of who was behind that, or whether we can expect that kind of thing to continue? I think for Sistani to be assassinated would be the beginning of a brand new chapter over there, right?
Yeah, Sistani's assassination, depending upon who did it, could blow up the country. He is the single most influential man in Iraq. My own feeling is that his aides, a number of whom have been killed over the past few months, were killed by the Baathists, by the guerrilla resistance.
But that's not the kind of thing that we would see Muqtada al-Sadr doing.
I don't believe so. Some of Muqtada's guys are capable of this sort of thing if they're angry over some issue. But to cold-bloodedly sit down and plot out the assassination of an Ayatollah who was close to Sistani, I don't think that's the Sadr movement. Actually, the Sadr movement has a reputation in the United States of being wild men, but they're actually fairly disciplined. In 2003 and into 2004, Muqtada al-Sadr their leader gave them strict orders not to tangle with U.S. troops. And they almost never did. There were very, very few incidents of that sort. So, to make them into assassins, I don't think so. I mean, in the height of the fighting with the Marines in Najaf, yes, they probably fired off some shots towards Sistani's house, and they can get angry like anyone else. But no, I think the attacks on the Shiite religious hierarchy in Iraq are almost certainly the work of Saddam's old friends who are still fighting the good fight.
Now, we don't have time, unfortunately, to actually go through the Constitution and maybe examine some of its drawbacks and good things about it. But what we do know is there's scheduled to be a referendum on October 15th, and the Telegraph is reporting today that Ayatollah Yaqoubi has denounced the new Constitution. And I've never even heard of this Ayatollah before. Who is he, and how much sway does he have?
Yeah, Ayatollah Yaqoubi is a disciple of Muhammad Sadiq al-Sadr, Muqtada's father. And the Sadr movement now has split. There are a number of splinter groups. The bulk of the Sadrists, of the people who follow Muhammad Sadiq al-Sadr, who, as I said, was killed by Saddam in 1999, the bulk of them follow Muqtada al-Sadr, the son. But a few do follow Ayatollah Yaqoubi, who is a disciple of Muhammad Sadiq al-Sadr, and his movement, which he calls the Fadila or Virtue Party, does have some strength in some Shiite cities in the south, in Nasiriyah, and then especially in Basra. And they did very well in the provincial elections in Basra. They captured, I think, they're the largest single group. They had about 16 out of 41 seats. And for a while, at least, they had put together a majority coalition on the council. So Yaqoubi is very influential in the southern port city of Basra, which, as I said, has about 1.3 million population. I don't think he probably is so influential that he can swing the Basra province against the Constitution, because Sistani has come out in favor of it, and the majority of Iraqi Shiites will follow him.
You do say on your blog today that the Telegraph has it wrong in thinking that there's even a chance that Sistani could talk this guy out of it, that perhaps unlike Sadr, Sistani really doesn't have much control over this guy at all.
No. Yaqoubi is an Ayatollah, and he is forbidden to blindly follow any other Ayatollah. He has to make an independent judgment. And he doesn't like Sistani at all. He thinks Sistani was quiet in the Saddam period, and that now he's cooperating with these Americans. Yaqoubi, like all of the Sadr branches, all of their leaders believe that the Americans should get out of Iraq right now, immediately, no delay. And Yaqoubi is rejecting the Constitution because it's not Islamic enough. He wants Islamic law to be more fully recognized. Now, the Constitution does say that the civil parliament may pass no legislation contravening the laws of Islam or the established laws of Islam. And that was in there at Sistani's insistence, but Yaqoubi says it's not enough. Just to say that it can't contravene the laws of Islam. It should say that the laws of Islam are the Constitution.
Well, yeah, the Virtue Party sounds kind of intimidating, doesn't it? Yeah,
well, they are Puritans. These guys, close down video stores, liquor stores, anything fun, they've gotten rid of.
Yeah. Now, we got to get into the Sunni insurgency a little bit here. Last time we talked, we discussed a little bit about how the Badr brigades and the Peshmergas had been offered by their leaders to go and take care of the problems with the insurgents. And the way I remember it is the United States said, thanks, but no thanks, we'll handle it. And the understanding really was that the Kurdish Peshmergas and the Sistani's Badr brigades probably really could go down and crush the insurgency, but to do so would require total warfare. And so the thing that puzzles me is I see George Bush on TV saying, well, listen, we can't leave until the Iraqi army is strong enough to protect itself, to protect the Iraqi state from the insurgents and the terrorists. And yet it sort of looks to me like the Sunnis are trying to keep us there, and what we're really doing is fighting to protect them from the majority who we've empowered.
Well, the Sunni Arab guerrillas want us out, and they're blowing us up to try to convince us to leave. They want the United States out of Iraq. And they are convinced that if they could get the United States out of Iraq, then they could kill Ibrahim Jaffari and Sistani and the new Shiite and Kurdish leadership of Iraq and make a coup and come back to power. They think they're a majority, which they're not. They're probably between 15 and 20%. But these, the Sunni Arabs of Iraq were the WASP. They were the elite. They were the equivalent of the Harvard MBAs and the West Point officer graduates and so forth. So they've got a sense of rule. They feel that they should be in control. So they're trying to push the United States out as part of a three-step plan, which ends with them coming back to power. The United States dissolved the Iraqi army. A lot of the guerrilla resistance fighters come from the army. They were thrown out by the Americans and thrown into unemployment. Therefore, we say there's an Iraqi government, but it doesn't have a military. There are about 3,000 trained troops that probably would fight in a fierce engagement with the enemy for the Iraqi government, but probably not much more than that at the moment. The U.S. hope is that over time that number will grow and they'll become more effective. So a lot of those 3,000 are apparently Kurdish and from the Peshmerga militia originally, and others are Shiites, and some of them may be Badr Corps. So the problem is that if the United States commits the Peshmerga, the Kurdish militia, and the Badr Corps, the Shiite militia, against, say, the Sunnis of Ramadi, then it makes it look like a sectarian war, and it encourages sectarian reprisals, and it could throw the whole country into civil war. So the U.S., to the extent that it commits troops, likes to paint them as Iraqi army troops rather than as Kurdish or Shiite or whatever. But in actual fact, in the fighting recently in the northern Turkmen city of Tel Afar, it appears to be the case that most of the troops involved on the Iraqi side were in fact Kurdish Peshmerga.
Oh, really fighting under the auspices of the Iraqi army, though?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
And this is very touchy because there's very bad blood between the Turkmen and the Kurds. So to have the U.S. Marines send in Kurdish fighters to fight Turkmen on the Turkish border, that's touchy, and you could have very substantial rioting in places like Kirkuk over this kind of thing.
I wonder whether that's deliberate or whether that's just stupidity. I mean, I think of sometimes you'll hear of commanders suggesting that we dip the bullets in pig blood first, and to basically be so scary that they'll stop trying to resist us. And it seems like there's a lot of trying to win hearts and minds on one hand and trying to terrify the hell out of people on the other hand. Are they doing that on purpose? Yeah, let's send the Kurds after the Turkmen, or are they just stupid?
Well, I think first of all, a lot of the U.S. military just don't know very much about Iraqi society and wouldn't necessarily be aware of how explosive this is. Second of all, they code those as Iraqi army troops. I mean, they are in the Iraqi army. They report to Ibrahim Jaffari, the prime minister. And so that's what they've got to commit. What they wanted to do was to do an operation where they could prove that the Iraqi troops could take the lead in the fighting. So they put these 4,000 or 5,000 Iraqi army troops right, at the head. The Marines came along behind. But what they've got, who will fight, are mainly Kurds, and so it's a conundrum. How do you form a national army when the Sunni Arabs are largely against it? Even if you have large numbers of them in the army, probably they'd be working for the other side. And if you don't have a national army, then it becomes a sectarian army. Then when you commit it against the Sunni Arabs, then it looks like a sectarian civil war.
So One thing that gets me is about the Sunnis, it seems to me trying to keep us there rather than drive us away. Obviously, bin Laden has said over and over he wants to draw us into his quicksand to bleed us dry. And it seems like if the Sunnis would just put down their guns and stop fighting for a while and they could get the Constitution ratified, then they can get rid of us and then they can try to have their bloody coup once we're gone. But as long as they keep fighting, it keeps us there longer, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, it may work out that way, but that's not their plan. First of all, there's a distinction between the bin Ladens and the kind of radical Muslim groups and the bulk of the Iraqi guerrilla resistance.
Right.
95% of the violence is being done by Iraqis, and by Iraqis from a Ba'ath Party background especially, or from a tribal background. So their strategy is not to keep the United States there at all. They're hoping that they will inflict enough damage on the United States that it will leave. And their fear is that if they don't do this, if they don't blow up U.S. troops and attack them and blow up what they see as collaborators of U.S. troops like the Iraqi police, that the U.S. is going to be there forever. So they have to get the U.S. out if they're going to have any chance of coming back to power.
All right, we got to go because we're going to talk with Debbie Clark from antiwar.com. She's going to report to us on the rally going on up in Washington, D.C. I want to thank you very much for your time today, sir.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, that's Juan Cole. You can check out his blog at juancole.com for the informed comment, and we'll be right back after this break.